Started in about 30 seconds, just letting a few folks trickle in. And we are currently going live from several platforms. We're on Restream, we're on YouTube, and we are on LinkedIn Live as well. And in about 15 seconds, we'll jump right into intros, but super excited to be here with Dexter, who is building a very cool. Actually, I won't even get into that. I'm going to just flip it over to him. Dexter, it's been a while since I guess we both were walking the halls at Dropbox together back in San Francisco. Now we're both in different places, but if you could actually just start by sharing a little bit about yourself and what is money abroad, we'll dive in from there. But super excited to be chatting with you today.
Me here, Arjun, and yeah, chat with everyone here today. LLCs and co-founders. Just a quick introduction of my website. So on helping build wealth abroad. Our core overseas expats, global citizens. They live in places like Singapore, even UK, and a lot of them work, tech, like us, they work things like Google, Facebook, and then they also work in different countries, and the complex of it's high. That's why I started this and used them before and itself. I lived in the area. I worked in there. We worked at together, and 7 years. That I started this journey.
Very cool. I think what's fun here is we're definitely going to dive into challenges, trends, and what both of us are seeing for international founders looking to enter the US. But I do have to ask, because a lot of founders here, or aspiring founders, current founders, are on the fence of or have launched a newsletter. I think this is something which, especially more recently, there's been new tools that have made it easier to get a newsletter off the ground. Could you quickly share how you decided to start a newsletter? I think you said you started it in 2019. I think it's obviously grown since then, and I think you've been growing your other channels too. But if you could take us back to that moment when you decided, I'm going to start this thing, what was your thought process then, and what actually inspired you to finally take the leap and persist until today and shipping each week on that newsletter?
Absolutely. So I started the newsletter in January this year, a half year ago. Started living abroad in 2019, and it's kind of the source of inspiration for some. They stem from my own challenges. So the reason why I started this newsletter is after seeing a lot of the challenges around personal finance, investing, stocks or business while in Singapore. I heard from a lot of their friends and colleagues they saw some similar topics, and there wasn't that information yet talking these kind of topics. So content related, and honestly, I just like I newsletters is that's a lot of good, but I enjoy your channel or video focus, like a channel something about honestly I just didn't have this.
Very cool. And I think what you highlighted, which I find fascinating, and I think we can dive in now, is there are definitely international challenges, or let's call it money challenges, which are unique for people who maybe are expats or have spent time in the US and are now abroad. And at Doola, we actually see that every day, where there's founders coming from different corners of the globe looking to set up in the US. And there's questions or concerns from everything around, should I come to the US? What type of entity should I form? Should I form in Delaware? Should I form in Wyoming? Should I form in a different state? And then how do I navigate taxes or even finances in terms of collecting dollars in the US, sending it back abroad, and making sure that I don't pay more taxes than I have to, but also I stay compliant. And with that, what Doola does is we do help people from around the world compliantly and confidently set up a US business. Oftentimes it is an LLC or a limited liability company. And then we help answer those common questions like, should I form an LLC or a C Corp? And what's the best state to form in? And trivia question, but I actually know the answer because we've asked many, many people this. If you actually poll founders and ask, what is the best state to form an LLC in? 90% plus of founders will give one state as the answer. Dexter, do you want to take a guess on what the state is?
I'm guessing it says Delaware.
You got it. So Delaware comes up 90% plus of the time. People say Delaware, and here's the thing: that's actually the wrong answer, and we can dive into why. But it's a little more complicated, but understandable. Where if you live outside the U.S., you can actually choose any state that you'd like to form your LLC in. Any state, all 50. If you live inside the U.S., though, you should actually form in the state which you live in because that's technically where you're doing business. And if you form outside of the state you're doing business in or live in, you end up having to pay multiple fees in multiple states. The state which you formed in, which might be Delaware, and let's say you live in New York, you then have to get a registered agent and pay for annual fees in that state. That's a common mistake we see from the get-go. But I think coming back to the non-US side, you can choose any state to form in. Which state should you form in? And what we've seen from founders is that Delaware and Wyoming are actually the two most popular states. Delaware is the most popular because most Fortune 500 companies are formed in Delaware. It's also popular because it has the prestige of being a Delaware company. That being said, did you know the first LLC was actually invented and created in Wyoming? You should not sleep on Wyoming. Some call it the Swiss Alps of the Rockies. And there's a cheaper annual fee in Wyoming versus Delaware. It's $60 per year to the state versus $300. They're also very crypto or blockchain friendly, very e-commerce friendly. And given that, at Doola, we actually see that Wyoming is the most popular state for non-US residents looking to form a US LLC. But you can't go wrong with Delaware as well. Given all of that, and I hope that little crash course was helpful for folks, Dexter, I'm curious what you see based on where you are in terms of the types of questions people have, and even what you've seen in terms of why people are interested in coming to the US to form a company or coming to the US to expand their business.
So when I talk to founders, in Singapore and APAC, a lot of them are interested in potentially targeting the US market, expanding their business to the US market. I'm not sure when they're first starting their business in Singapore that they've considered incorporating in the US either. So that doesn't really come up as like one of the options that's top of mind. The reason is because Singapore has like pretty good rule of law, that has a pretty good kind of like business incorporation set of services, and so it's pretty easy for founders to incorporate there. With that said, if they want to get a U.S. business bank account in the future, if they want to enter the U.S., and start working with U.S. customers, then maybe the incorporation setup might look different. And also another thing that's pretty interesting is in some countries like Singapore, there's restrictions on who can be a foreign owner, or like there's restrictions on the foreign ownership of the entity itself. So if you're incorporating in Singapore as a foreigner, then there are limitations where you need to have a local director that's part of your entity. And typically that it's not a hard thing to solve for, but then it does just come with extra fees. And so I've talked to at least two founders who took a look at US LLC incorporation and realized like, wow, okay, actually, I don't need like a local director in the US. And that kind of makes things, lower costs, right? So I think that's just something that I'd like to share for founders, because after doing some research and talking to founders in Singapore, that came up in conversations.
That's really insightful. And I think we've heard the same thing where founders will come to us and say, I didn't realize it's actually easier or maybe more simple to form a business in the US than it is in the region that they're currently located in, and have heard great things about Singapore entities specifically. But I think this is where I can share a few things that we're seeing in terms of why are international founders looking to come to the US. And I think from there, then we can quickly dive into the pros and cons, or even the specific types of entities we typically see. But from our side, and I'm curious to see what you've seen too, one of the biggest reasons why folks are looking to enter the US market, and why now in terms of entering the US market too, the biggest one we see is the ability to sell to US customers. Now, just because you don't have a US entity doesn't mean you can't sell to US businesses. You can have a UK bank account, an Indian bank account, a Singapore bank account. But by having a US LLC or a US company, you can then get a US tax identification number, your EIN, which then gets you a US business bank account. And with that business bank account, you can then set up something like Stripe for payments. And now you can transact globally and collect dollars from anywhere in the world. And the truth is, for US customers, if you're trying to transact in another currency, it's going to create friction versus being able to have a checkout page in dollars. Also, and this is the truth, having the US company does add credibility or legitimacy. It's not the fact that, hey, I'm not going to buy from an international business. But if someone sees this is a US company, automatically, one, as an individual, let's say you are a solopreneur, you go from being a freelancer to a legitimate business. And then two, prospective buyers will see, okay, this is a legitimate business as well. And that credibility can help for obviously the buyer, but also I think we've seen founders sort of gain that level of confidence from going from freelancer to actually running a business, do that through that formation process. And I think the biggest thing we're seeing is that despite macro concerns and despite everything happening in the macro economy, the US Census.gov recently published formation statistics and close to all-time highs last quarter, which I think is bananas, but it goes
Oh,
to
wow.
show that regardless of what's happening in the economy, people will always be looking to start businesses. Whether it's a newsletter business, whether it's an e-commerce business, a SaaS business, or a consulting business, now is the time, and it's easier than ever given tools like no-code website tools or tools like Doola. We are trying to literally make it easier for folks to get their businesses started. And a combination of those reasons mean now is the time. If you have that idea, there are really, really, really less barriers to getting started, low cost options to
Yeah.
form the company, ways to get advice on consulting and on taxes, bookkeeping, whatever it might be as well. But given all that, have you seen, or what are you personally seeing from maybe the biggest reasons why people are hesitant about starting? And it doesn't even have to be starting in the US, but this could be just overall concerns people have before they actually take the plunge and start a business.
For sure. So first, I'll just highlight maybe a couple of observations, from founders in the APAC region, and a lot of them want to enter, are interested in exploring the US market. So even if their business is, maybe they have a main company that's focused on the APAC market, they're kind of interested in always working with US customers, either for that business, for a different business, maybe for a side hustle. So I think that's, at least from my observation, the primary motivation for them to, work in the U.S. market is to be able to then serve U.S. customers and tap into a larger market. A lot of times, what's unique about founders who start in Singapore is that it's a relatively small market, so they have to think global, really, from day one, right? They can't really focus on just capturing a local market. It would be like, founder in the US just focusing on New York City, right? You can be from New York City, but like you got to focus on the whole, country, right? So I do see that. And then what's preventing them, I suppose, from starting their business now? Maybe I do see, a few people who, they're tech employees. They want to start a business, but then there's fear, right? The fear of taking the plunge, especially in macro times that don't look so positive, and where startup funding is still low. So I think the question that I'm hearing a lot is, is now even a good time to start a business?
Really good points across the board there. And what I want to do now is actually get into a little bit more of the nitty gritty around what actually it takes to set up a US business. And along the way, can pause to see if there's any questions. But I think the first thing is when folks are thinking, okay, thinking global from day one. I love what you said there. That's a really good analogy. If you're in the US, you're thinking full US. You're not thinking just your city. Although you should start small, niching down is good. But especially for international founders in today's day and age, you can think global from day one. And I think your business has to be global, given that there are going to be customers coming from everywhere. But first question we typically get is, okay, should I form an LLC or a C Corp, which are the two major entity types in the US? And the way I actually answer this question to provide a concrete answer is there's really two paths again. If you are looking to raise US venture capital, meaning from an institutional investor, an angel investor, you're applying to an accelerator like Y Combinator or Techstars, whatever it might be, US investors are typically going to require a Delaware C Corp. That's the standard. The Delaware C Corp, the C Corporation, provides a structure to easily administer stock and equity. There's a dual tax structure too. So there's a corporate tax, then a tax on individual profits or revenues that are passed through. But that entity type or structure is required by US investors. That actually simplifies the decision. If you are going down that route, an investor has a check they're ready to send to you, you're applying to an accelerator, and you're dead set on going down that path, you're going to need that Delaware C Corp. If you are not, though, 9 times out of 10, actually, I'd say 999 times out of 1,000, an LLC is typically going to be the best way to go. Now, there are some caveats. Caveats being your country might have a different tax treaty arrangement with the US, or maybe your unique situation might mean that it is better to have a C Corp for tax purposes. But oftentimes what we see is the LLC, which is a pass-through entity, meaning if you don't have that physical presence in the US, you pay taxes where you reside. There's an informational filing due in the US, but you pay your taxes. Let's say you're in Singapore or in India, you pay taxes there. The LLC is a simpler, easier to maintain, and more flexible choice in terms of tax flexibility too. And as we said earlier, you can actually form that LLC in all 50 states in the US, but typically we see Wyoming is the most popular, followed by Delaware for international founders. With all that in mind, if you do go down the path of forming that LLC, next major question we get, and this is actually even before, is can I set up a US business bank account? Because what you don't want to do is go through that process of forming and realize, wait a second, can I even get the bank account? That was my ultimate goal. And the good news is today, and this has been a change over the last few years, there are now banks that will support founders from opening a US business bank account without a social security number and without having to physically visit the US. Believe it or not, there was a requirement until recently. Banks would say, hey, you have to come walk into the branch, meet the broker, meet the teller, and then open the bank account. If you're in the US, that's easy. You take it for granted. If you're in New York, you can see a Charles Schwab or a Wells Fargo on pretty much every street corner. If you're outside the US, flying to the US, hey, if you have a vacation here, amazing. You can toss that in, but that can be financially prohibitive. And up until recently, COVID was also happening globally as well. So that was a barrier there. But the good news is you can now, again, without a social security number and without visiting the US, open that US business bank account. The final thing I would add here, though, for folks listening, is there are certain countries that are restricted from opening a bank account. This isn't a restriction I make or Doola makes. This is a restriction set by the US federal government. There are certain countries on the OFAC list, or there might be certain sanctions against certain regions or countries. You can check that list online, but the good news is most countries globally are not on that list. There's a few countries in Africa, a few countries in the Middle East, one like Pakistan, South Sudan, etc. And again, these regulations and sanctions can change over time. So check out that final list, and that's the other piece of advice I would give is just double check, hey, am I in a country, do I live in a country where I can open that bank account? If so, then you are good to go. You can form that LLC, get your tax identification number, and then once you have the bank account, you would connect it to Stripe. Final thing I'll just touch on here before really I think diving into maybe the final cost implications and tax implications is in terms of the pros and cons. I think the biggest thing we've seen is having a limited liability company. The biggest benefit's in the name. It's that liability. And it's, in this case, that liability protection, where when you're starting a business, it doesn't matter what kind of business you're starting, the last thing you're thinking of is a lawsuit. Why would someone come sue and litigate my company? I'm just starting. Like maybe I have a few newsletter subscribers or there's one customer or two prospective customers. But what can happen, and unfortunately this has happened in the past, is if there is a litigation or a lawsuit, God forbid anything goes wrong, if you do not have liability protection via an entity, your personal assets are actually at risk in the case of a lawsuit. Personal assets could be the money in your bank account, your house, whatever it might be. If it does go to a lawsuit, that is at risk. And by forming that LLC, really for a couple $100. What you're paying for is not only the liability protection, but I like to think of it as you're paying for that peace of mind where you can sleep at night and know, hey, God forbid if something does happen, I have that shield or that separation between personal and business from the company itself and from the bank account as well. And I think that's a big thing, which again, when you're starting, obviously, every single dollar is tight. That's how you should run a business. You should think, hey, does this dollar really going to help? Can I put this dollar in? What's the return going to be? But I think that would be probably the biggest pro we see from forming a company is you get that liability protection, you get
No.
that peace of mind, and it opens up the door. Again, I love what you said of thinking global from day one and using that US company and using the way to transact in dollars as that hub there. Curious if there's anything to add there. Otherwise, we can then just dive into maybe some of the comparisons between tax implications for Singapore and the US.
Nothing to add, but I am surprised that up until recently, no one from overseas could actually open a U.S. business bank account without actually stepping foot in the U.S. So I guess that's one of the blessings in disguise for COVID, like helping accelerate some of those processes. And yeah, I'm curious to hear more. But that's pretty interesting.
Just to add on that, there are still some, let's call them legacy banks that still do require you to visit the US.
Okay.
So, for example, Bank of America, that's a name that comes up a lot. They've been around for a while. They will still require that you actually come to the US and visit a branch. Versus a lot of these neobanks. Neobanks, they're companies like Brex, Mercury, Doola has a banking option. You can actually, these are banks which build software on top of an underlying bank, which is based in the US. But
Yeah.
for many of these banks, and there's more, you do not have to visit the US anymore. And I think that trend is great. I think it truly democratizes access to American entrepreneurship and to the American financial ecosystem for legitimate businesses around the world. But with that, I think final thing I just want to quickly touch on, and got this question in the chat as well, is really giving a little deep dive into tax filings. Is there a company tax? Is there a personal tax? How does this work? Obligatory disclaimer, I'm not a CPA, but I now joke that after having worked with thousands of founders and really going down these rabbit holes, in my next life, I could be an international tax CPA. So we offer consultations. You can live chat us online. We have a tax prep service as well. But I'm going to give you a just little rundown in terms of what you can expect from taxes. The most important thing to consider is, do you have what's called effectively connected income with the US? Let me understand what that is. Let me help you understand what that is. You might hear that acronym of ECI, effectively connected income. What this means is the income you are making from having your US company connected to the US or not? And the way this is defined is that, and the easiest way for you to think about it is think of the word physical. Do you have a physical presence in the US? Are you physically located there, you personally? If you are, very likely you're going to have a US tax filing or tax obligation. Number two, do you have employees physically based there? Full-time employees, not just a contractor or a consultant, but a full-time employee physically based there. If that's the case, you likely have effectively connected income. Number three, do you have a physical office there? Just keep thinking physical. Is it a building? Is it something you own specifically there? Not some third-party warehouse if you're selling on Amazon, but do you have physical property there? If you're going through this checklist for yourself and you have anything physical based in the US, you likely are going to have that effectively connected income, which means you would have an income tax obligation in the US as well. Now, if you do not, the good news is with an LLC, it's a pass-through entity, meaning unlike a C Corp, which has the corporate tax, a tax on the business, and the individual tax, which would come through on profit or revenue that passes through, dollars you earn from your US C Corp, let's say it goes to your bank account, when you then pay yourself and send the money back internationally, you would then pay taxes in the country you live in based on how much you're paying yourself. In the US,
Right.
there's this informational tax filing requirement. And I think this can trip people up, but think of the informational tax filing requirement as purely that, informationally you telling the government, hey, this is my business, we did this much in revenue, here's the status of the company. That is an informational filing requirement, which can be called a tax filing, but you're not actually paying income taxes in the US if you do not have that effectively connected income, or again, think physical. And I think that is truly quite special, where again, if you have this digital online business, you're not physically based here, you can have the benefits of selling to US customers, expanding globally, thinking globally from day one with the dollar, but you're paying that effective income tax in your country. Now, I know that can be a mouthful. So again, we are happy to offer consultations on this. We have guides that we've done. There's additional webinars and content on taxes specifically. But I think that's the biggest thing, which is a lot of folks learn this and they're like, whoa, this sounds too good to be true. It can be too good to be true if you make sure you make some of these right decisions, right? LLC versus C Corp, do you form in the right state? And are you thinking through, hey, do I have effectively connected income or not? And that's why Doola exists. We want to help educate folks. Even if you don't work with us, just at least understand, get these few critical decisions right. They're not irreversible. If you make a mistake, you can always go back, but yes, there's going to be friction. But if you can make these correct decisions, LLC versus C Corp, picking the right state, and then properly submitting your informational tax filings, there are major, major benefits. And coming back to what you said, Dexter, I think a lot of people, or what we've heard too, is that a lot of people realize, whoa, it actually is simpler and easier to get set up in the US versus other countries. And if that's the case, if it makes sense for your business to expand to the US, then we're obviously happy to help here. And I think it's also incredible that, folks like yourself are providing more resources overall on your finances, whether it's personal and how that ties to potentially businesses in Singapore and businesses in the US as well.
Hey, thanks for walking us through all of that tax detail. That was also something new to me. So, as an example here, my wife is Australian, and she actually went through the process recently to incorporate a Wyoming LLC with Doola, and uh, she doesn't know exactly what she's going to be doing with it yet, but let's say that if she's running a digital kind of like online business, most of her services are delivered online, then from what you're saying, like as long as she doesn't have that physical kind of presence in the US, like an office or staff in the US, then because it's a pass-through entity, then it sounds like there's actually her personal income would just be subject to like where she's based, like the jurisdiction she's based in, and it's not based on US income tax. Am I getting that correct?
Hey, you might have to come do webinars on taxes for us. That was a good summary. But I think the one thing I'll highlight here is that if you have
Yeah.
questions, don't hesitate to reach out. And there can be certain countries where this isn't always the case. For example, in Canada and the US have maybe a slightly different tax treaty versus the UK or India or Australia or other places.
Okay.
And in that case, there could be slightly different tax considerations. However, what that means is that it's not impossible to properly stay compliant. It just might mean a different filing or maybe a different informational filing, maybe a different identification number you need, etc. So yeah, given all that though, I think really the thing that I like to share with folks is, hey, it is possible to stay compliant. It's possible to do that properly. And I think the big thing too is that, just to recap, really check on tax treaties. Whether it's any professional CPA, I think that's an important thing to double check. And then really just do your homework. And this is where you can talk to a professional on, hey, for my country specifically, is there also anything in my local country that I need to be aware of? At Doola, we partner with CPAs. We have CPAs in-house to really provide that guidance on the US side. But I always recommend talk to a professional in your local jurisdiction to understand taxes there as well. So if you're in Singapore, if you're in India, if you're in the UK, really double check on that. And one thing which we're working on is actually creating country by country guides on, hey, most of the time, if I'm coming from Canada or Australia or the UK, what are the tax considerations to keep in mind? So really just helping it personalize it for folks. But yeah, I think overall here, Dexter, I think it's going to be really fun to sort of just see and, learn from you, especially on what problems you're seeing from founders in terms of finances internationally. But to wrap things up here, if anyone has questions about forming a US business, you can check out doola.com. But also a little special surprise we wanted to do is that for folks who stuck around, we actually did want to give away a free LLC to someone, meaning someone who forms with us, we're going to waive those fees. And yeah, Dexter, I know Dexter has a little link here. We're excited to help, the Money Abroad audience and folks working with Dexter as well. So Dexter, where can people find you? And then also, if people are looking to eventually, members of your audience, folks reading your newsletter, eventually are looking to form a company too, where can they best find any links or resources on that specifically?
Absolutely. So you can go to moneyabroad.co. So that's just moneyabroad.co. And you can find all of the newsletter, website content, and social links there.
Amazing. Well, hey, for folks who tuned in, to be eligible for that free LLC, make sure that you signed up and entered your email on the registration page for this event. You can find it on my social, Dexter's social. Make sure your email's in there. And whether or not you are looking to form your business today or in the future, remember the time is never better. Or yesterday was the best day. The second best day is today. I think it's really inspirational seeing Dexter start his business and see the growth he's seeing there. And we love working with founders from all over the world. So I hope this session was impactful. I hope you learned something new. And seriously, for anyone out there, if you have any questions, we offer free consultations, live chat. We have CPAs who can help answer. We have a partner network of CPAs as well. And we're really excited to hopefully work with you in the future and hope you learned something new today. Sweet. Thank you, everyone. And this will be recorded. We'll be sharing out the link after, but hope everyone has a fantastic rest of their day and a fantastic rest of the week and weekend.
Thanks, everyone, for tuning in. That was fun, Arjun.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks, Dexter.
Cool.